Great. So this is session 3. Welcome back, Brian. Welcome back, everyone online. Welcome back, people who are in the other room in our chapel. And again, I just remind you that if you have any questions, you can just put it in the chat and Brian will be able to look at them today or as we prepare for the next 3 or 4 modules tomorrow, okay? So Brian, you're on. Take it away. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I hope that I'm enjoying a cup of coffee. And I hope that you're finding this productive. We talked about kind of did an introductory session. We talked about the causes of conflict. And remember, we're trying to keep looking at that case study of that worst conflict that you ever had. I can't imagine. And kind of evaluate that and what would we do differently? And I mean, so many things I would do differently. But most of the time we don't get a do-over. We just get a look ahead. So that's all we can do. There's some things that we can't change. One of the things we can't change is mistakes that we made in the past or conflicts we've caused in the past. We can't change that, but we can influence the future. And that's, as we're looking at this session here of the seminar, a biblical response to conflict. We're going to now bring, I already have some, but we're going to bring the scriptures to bear a little bit more. And that's going to like jump us into the session 4, which is, understanding the practical, some basic methods of resolving conflict. And then 5 is like, what is our conflict style? So we're building into this, and I believe that it'll continue to help us, and we'll be able to find some real tools as well as some real answers for some learning points, some real answers for why things might have went wrong in the past. Okay, so I think in this session, we want to look at what is God's perspective on our conflicts, and what is God's perspective really like, because we are just looking at things. Of course, we're spirit, soul, and body, so we're looking at things through our human eyes. And I'm reminded of the messenger in the Old Testament where he was asked, whose side are you on? Are you on my side or the enemy's side? And the messenger angel responded and said, neither one. I'm on the Lord's side. So it reminds me that the Lord has a perspective that might be different than mine, and maybe even is different than my person that I'm in conflict with, or the topic of the conflict. And then honestly, some conflict is good. We get good solutions. We get good answers sometimes when we're seeing things from a different perspective. We always want to encourage that and so forth. But conflict that starts to spiral out of control and starts to become destructive, then that's where we have to start to use our tools and call time out and whatnot. But God's perspective, what is God's perspective? I have to be reminded that, especially if this is another person in the church, another believer, I have to be reminded when I'm in conflict with this person that this is my brother who I will be in heaven with for all of eternity. So like, I might not talk to him on the street here because we had a conflict, but am I not going to talk to him in heaven? Is that really what heaven's going to be like? Or, God forbid that's, this scenario, but we have to kind of look at that, not only in the church, this is my brother and I'm going to be in heaven with this person, but also if it's not a Christian, then my neighbor who's not a believer, like I still am going to be accountable for how I interacted with him. And I'm like, yeah, we're arguing over 1 foot of space where he planted a tree and it came over on my property. And I, went with a chainsaw in the middle of the night and cut his tree down. I'm like, I will answer to God. I didn't do that, by the way, but we will answer to God for that, even though he's not my brother at this point, and I might actually be keeping him from becoming my brother or coming, when I'm going to do that, cut his tree down and argue over that 6 inches of land, and then I'm going to invite him to my life group. Not going to work, right? Or I'm going to invite him to our church then, and so no, I mean, I have to be honorable in all of our be honorable in all of our interactions with all people. The person that we behind the counter, we stop and get a cup of coffee. We have to be honorable in that exchange, even if, they didn't fill it up enough, or it's not quite the right thing. Like, we're going to have to just be honorable in all our interactions. And I was reminded of this, like, you're going to be in heaven with this person, because we were trying to get to the points on this is that we were in a discussion. There was a person who had passed away, and I was part of helping to decide what happened to the money. I guess, what is the term? Executor, or part of a decision. Wasn't actually the executor, part of some decision of some of the money that this person, a great man of God, business guy, passed away, and he left some money towards in an area that I was responsible for. So we're meeting and talking about this, and we're talking about, like, he left some direction about where it should be, the money should be directed towards, one of these three things, or all in these three things. So we were like talking this back and forth, and, how about this? We could use it for that project, or maybe over here we could use it for that project. And then somebody said this, which really got my attention. His name, I'll just call him Art. It wasn't his real name, but this person said in the meeting, he said, one thing we know for sure, because we were all believers and Art was a believer. He says, one thing we know for sure is that we'll see Art again when we get to heaven. And so we'll have the opportunity to talk to him. We'll have a conversation about how we distributed this money, if it was according to how he intended or not. Like, and then it wasn't like, to be a fearful thing, or like, but it was a good reminder, like, yeah, we really need to have Art's intentions of how this money was distributed, because we will see him again in heaven. And that kind of realigns me to thinking about how we treat people, and especially how we interact with other people in the church. I love James chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. I mean, we don't really have to go over there now, but in James chapter 4, 1 through 12, he's talking about treating everybody the same. Like, if a wealthy person comes into our church meeting and dressed nice and looks like they're going to put a bunch of money in the offering, or versus in my kind of vernacular, or just as a metaphorical, or a homeless person comes into our church that obviously doesn't have any money, and are we going to treat the two of them the same, is what he's going after there in James chapter 4. And really at the core of that is treating everyone the same, everyone with respect, because going back to where we just mentioned previously, all is God's creation. Like, all of humanity is created by God. And because they are created in God's image, they have the image of God on them, Christian and non-Christian. And so we have to treat them with respect. One of the things that the scriptures speak to, talking about the biblical response to conflict, is this thing of humility. It's interesting, when we were talking about different values, or when different values, that was in Romans chapter 14, we talked about the more mature person would be the one who would defer to the immature person. And that has to do with humility. A prideful person would say, no, I want it my way. And really, that raises the question if you are the more mature person. But that it's interesting, because there's an aspect of humility in that. And so I read here in Matthew chapter 7, verses 3 through 5, that when we're resolved in conflict, the other person, it could be wrong, and probably is wrong, but we have to start looking at the log in our own eye. How am I contributing to this conflict? And that's the thing that we can make a difference on. We might not be able to change that other person. We might not be able to change something like the weather or the economy, things that are out of our control. But what we can change is our perspective. And if we need to somehow lower things a couple of notches to a place of humility and say, hey, I don't know what happened in our discussion yesterday. I said some things I shouldn't have said. You don't have to go into all the gory details. You could, but let's get a fresh start. I want to really hear today. I want to really hear what you're saying. So I'm going to shut up and I'm going to listen to you. You just go ahead and talk and present your case. You're presenting you still might not agree with them, but you're approaching this in humility. And what we find is that when you sow humility, then you also reap humility. And the person might or might not say, they might say, you know what, I was out of control yesterday too. I apologize. I want to start a fresh start. But if they don't, that's fine. But if they do, then it just creates a new platform for resolving conflict. So Matthew chapter 7, we'll just read these verses together. It's in your notes there. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Obviously, a comparison of size. How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? This is Jesus talking. You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly, to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And I think this just speaks to this so well of the posture of humbling yourself. And of course, we know that as we humble ourselves, God is the one who lifts us up. And that's true in relationships as well. As we humble ourselves in our relationships, especially in areas of conflict, we net whether or not the other person reciprocates, we net the benefit of that. We net the peace. Because remember, one of our scriptures, while we're scanning down your notes here, is that we understand that we want to be at peace with all men as it's possible with us. There are conflicts that cannot be resolved. There's times that we agree to disagree, but we still have that. We still have the release that comes in our direction. So, one of the authors that I enjoy reading and have benefited from is a gentleman by the name of Stephen Covey. And he wrote a book, 7 Habits of Successful People. Now, he's a godly man. He's actually a Mormon. He's not a born-again believer that I know of anyway. Maybe he is somehow Mormon church. I don't understand that. But he's a godly man, has a godly worldview. And then one of his 7 habits of highly successful people, I believe, is the title of the book. By the way, I apologize for these notes because this just came right out of my typing this week. I didn't have any time to send it to our editors. And so a lot of Dove's training manuals look a lot better than your notes do right here. But if we do this seminar again, it'll be a lot better. I think I repeated things a couple times here occasionally and whatnot. But if we ever do this again, then we'll have this all edited and it'll be a nice, better formatted. So I give that apology. But one of the things, I was going to say, then we'll have full credit. I'll put in here, this is Stephen Covey's material, or Stephen Covey said this, because I think it's important to credit those folks where you get content from. And he said this. He said, seek to understand rather than to be understood. That was one of his seven laws of highly successful people, which of course is a biblical concept, but he doesn't present it as such in his material. And there's various iterations. There's 7 habits for highly successful youth. There's all kinds of iterations of this one book that Stephen Covey did. But one of his 7 is seek to understand rather than to be understood. And so what he obviously is pretty clear is put your energy into understanding the other person, their perspective, why they think what they think, what is different that they see that you don't see. And the scripture speaks to this, Proverbs chapter 18. Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions. So dependent on who you are and how God made you, like if you're in the disc personality, you're the high I, that verbal person, that would be me. I usually end up in a high I or a high C, depending on the format or the area where I'm operating. So my classic to be self-aware when I'm high I, I'm talking and rambling on and on. And usually if the other person is talking, I'm not listening to them. I'm thinking about what I want to say next. So this is, bam, this is a bullseye for me, especially with my personality. Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions. So I want to be self-aware according to the biblical response to conflict. I want to be self-aware that I got to shut up and really listen to what they're saying, not be thinking about my next comment or the next thing I want to add or whatnot. We find also in James chapter 1, verse 19, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. So here, hundreds and thousands of years ago, was written about emotional intelligence, the EQ, what modern sociologists call EQ, is right here in James chapter 1, verse 19. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. It's talking about controlling your emotions. It doesn't say it's wrong to become angry. That's an emotion. It's a human emotion. And it's just like, what do you do with that anger? How do you handle it? How do you process that? And so on and so forth. Different discussion for a different day. Well, I want to go through that. There it is. The Bible says we should seek to understand, and Stephen Covey coined it like this: seek to understand, not to be understood. And all of us would desire to be understood, and which is great, but that reciprocates as well. When we're seeking to understand the other person, helps us have a better perspective on us. It helps us to be better understood as well. So the next thing I want to mention is the Bible would tell us that we should be aware that we tell stories. And when we tell story, we generally tell stories that are based on our view of an event that happened, or our experience, or our remembrance of a conflict that happened. And so we tell, it's a story, but it's really our perspective on the facts, or what we saw as the facts. So, Larry Kreider, or the international director of Dove, is fond of saying there's three sides to every situation. There's your side, there's my side, and there's what actually happened. Okay. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, but we each have a story. Like, I was being, totally innocent, and I was just doing my job, and my coworker stormed into my, office, interrupted me, and blah, blah, blah. That's my side of the story. It's not, maybe he had an emergency, or maybe, you know what I mean? So, but we all have a story, and we tend to speak in stories. It's our interpretation of the facts. So, but we want to resolve conflict, we want to get out of our stories and get into just the facts, back to the facts. So I don't know, there's an old TV show from years ago. It was on TV many years. This was broadcast TV when I was growing up. It's called Dragnet. And one of the main characters, some of your oldsters might remember this, was Sergeant Joe Friday. And it was about, I think it was about FBI investigating these crimes and so forth. But Sergeant Joe Friday had, when he was interviewing a witness, he would always say, just the facts, ma'am, nothing but the facts. And so that rings in my heart, in my head, when I'm thinking about, like, not telling the story, but just telling the facts, like, just the facts, Brian, nothing but the facts, Brian. And so I think that's helpful. Proverbs 18:17 says, the person who tells one side of a story seems right until someone else comes and asks questions. If you've ever been in a court of law, like, man, you can hear one side of it and you're like, man, that person is guilty. Absolutely 100% guilty. And then you listen, and then the defense comes up and raises a question about that, and raises a question about that, and says, now this person is testifying the exact opposite of that person. And like, it raises a question mark, like, well, I don't know if they're guilty anymore. I don't know if they're guilty. I'm not sure. And so that happens when we're in conflicts. Is this just a simple scripture? I love it. It comes from Proverbs. The person who tells one side of the story seems right until someone else comes and asks questions. And so that is why we try to not tell our story, but try to stick to the facts as best recall. And sometimes it's, when we present the facts, it's okay to just say, here's what I feel like happened, and ask that person to respond. Like, is that your perspective of what happened? Are those the facts that you see? And they'll say, well, yeah, that, but you missed this too, that also happened. That maybe a fact that I left out or missed or didn't remember. And it was really, they would add, okay, so here's another fact. So you're establishing the facts together rather than just your perspective and your take on the stories. But it really comes back to, the Bible is indicating for us, what is God saying to me? So as a believer, I want to be listening to the Lord so that I can I can change. I want to get better. So I want to get better at conflict. I want to get better at life. I want to get better at everything that God's called me to do because I want to be a good steward. I mean, I think we don't have to go to chapter and verse, but we know the Bible asks us, God is asking us to be good stewards of our gifts and our talents. And we're spending hours and hours in meetings about conflict, trying to resolve conflict. And we're spending all this emotional energy being mad and building up stories and building cases up against people about things that happened. And now all of our emotions are kind of on this sidebar of conflict and we have meetings upon meetings to figure out who said what. And then now all this energy is going over there rather than going forward to grow the kingdom, to establish my destiny, the things, the goals, the things I feel called to do. All that energy is getting sidetracked now into these side peripheral conflicts and conflict resolutions and meetings upon meetings. And so it's really keeping me from doing what I'm called to do. And I will talk a little bit more about this in the future, how to see what's not our what's not our battle. That's the way I'll say it. How we can choose our battles wisely and walk away from the ones that really aren't our battles to fight, or it's really not prudent for us to fight them. It really doesn't matter. I know my wife and I had some different situation where I was seeing one thing and we were kind of going back and forth about this. She was seeing the other thing, and it was about an event that was going to happen on a certain day. And then as it turned out, like you had this big discussion, this big conflict about, well, should we do it this way or should we do it that way? And as it turned out, it rained that day and the whole event was canceled. It was all meaningless. All of our conflict about who was right or what's the best way to do this. I had my side. We're kind of trying to convince each other. And then it rained and the event didn't even happen. And we had all that energy spent in this conflict that was meaningless. It was just sapped. It just sapped our energy and so forth. And so for myself, I want to be aware of what God is saying to me so that I'm not dissipating energy. And then I want to read this verse from Romans 12 because I mentioned it different times. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So peace means it's the absence. Let me say it this way. It's not the lack of conflict. It's the absence of unresolved conflict. So it might be you just resolve the conflict as far as you could go. You forgave that person. They could still be angry at you. They could still be writing bad things about you on social media and whatnot. But as far as you've laid your soul bare before the Lord and you've asked them to forgive you, and then what they do from there is their business between them and God. And He's a better disciplinarian than you are. I mean, if any permanent change is going to come, it's not because of you doing this as a peer. It's going to be because of God interacting with them as a father, especially if it's a believer and so forth. But so that's that Romans 12:18. We want to kind of leave that like in the midst of things here as we're talking about what is the biblical response here. If you are building a team, it could be a team of moms for your kids' school. Could be a team. It could be a church planning team. It could be a ministry team. Could be a team that's going to plan an event. Your team will benefit if it's a diverse team. And so, as we mentioned before, it's good to have people that have opposite perspectives. Proverbs 15 verse 1 says, "A gentle, soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger." There it is again, emotional intelligence. So, kudos to whoever coined that term and wrote a book about emotional intelligence and earned $1 million, whatever. It was in the Bible many, many, many years ago. And, we were taught, the early believers were taught to have emotional intelligence. It's just character, basically. It's just like exercising the fruit of the Holy Spirit. And so I love this here. The soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. So I have a testimony about this, and I just want to present it to you, or I just want to share it with you. This is actually the story of when I had 300 angry parents in a room directing their wrath and their anger at me as I was the president of the school board. And I'll just tell you exactly what happened. I'm going to share about this. because I used this Proverbs 15 and verse 1. And I'm going to share just an amazing thing that God did based on this. And at that point in time, I was the president. I remember this so clearly. I had been on the school board for 7 years, elected each time I was elected. It's a 4-year term. So I was elected to the school board, and I was on the school board. And at that point, I was the president of the school board, which was the reason I was the one up front with all these angry parents talking to me. And our superintendent made a decision. It wasn't even my decision. It was my responsibility. Our superintendent made a decision to go public about a discussion we were having about closing a certain school. So our district had like 3,000 students. So there was probably maybe 7 or 8 different buildings, primary and secondary and special services and whatnot. So there's probably about 7 buildings, and our board was just having this discussion. Again, very innocent. This is my story. I'm telling you my side, right? And very innocent. So we were trying to save the school district money by not building a certain building and not keeping a building open. We saw some efficiencies and so forth. But our superintendent, my fault, this is still behind the scenes discussion, went public with this, and it created a huge uproar because, of course, all the parents who had children going to that elementary school, they didn't want their child's school to close because they didn't want them to have to change buildings. So this became a huge uproar in our community. And literally these parents, it caused them to question the whole board and the wisdom of the board. And they formed a political action committee. They went out and formed a nonprofit so they could resist the closing of this school building, which it wasn't even decided that this building was going to be closed. It was just being discussed. And so they formed a political action committee. And so the next time to lobby, so they could lobby, and they started to oppose us. And that was this meeting with the 300 angry parents, were all parents from the community who were against opposing this school. And again, it was just a matter of discussion. And so all of this anger, since I was the president of the board, I was in the front of the room. And this is when they had a picture, there's a big article on the front page of the newspaper. My picture standing in front of these 300 angry people was in the front page of the newspaper, our local newspaper, and above the fold, and just a story about this whole angry thing. And the police were called, and it went on. And finally we closed it down, and like we weren't getting anywhere and so forth. But the rest of the story is this political action committee, they formed, it just so happened it was right on the cusp of election for the school board. It's all elected people. And they formed a political action committee, and they ran a slate of 5 candidates. I was the president of the school board against the five of the candidates. Now, I wasn't up for re-election. So there was 4 existing and 5 that were up for re-election. So these parents ran these 5 candidates, and they all got elected because they caused such an uproar. There was signs all over the community. All 5 of them got elected. And so the very first thing, they're sworn into office. There's 9. So when they bring in 5 people, they have a majority. The very first thing that they did is they elected their own president of the board, and they threw me out as the board president. Just like that was their main thing, was to get me out of leadership and to take this thing over. Well, as it turns out, it was a new board member and now new president of the board. And this is a very complex leadership position. There's hundreds and hundreds of regulations. There's hundreds and hundreds of expectations the state has on the school district and so forth. Very complex. It's public. There's different things that can be public and private. There's reporters at each meeting. Everything is public. You have to know how to talk to reporters and all of this thing. And so they just came in, all 5 of them. They threw me out as a board president. They were criticizing me. This is where the letters were written to the editor. Mr. Sauder, you need to resign. And in that moment, I came right to this office right here where I am right now. And in that moment, I sat down here and I made a list of like 15 people. Maybe it was more than that. Maybe it's 20. Just wrote names down. There's like superintendent, it was reporters, it was some of these parents, it was some of the new board members, it was the newspaper editor, which I talked to, or my wife talked to. And I went through, and by name, I forgave each one of them. I didn't go out and ask them to forgive me, because anyway, just didn't go there. But I went by name and I asked God to forgive me. Excuse me. I asked God to forgive. I forgave them for the offense that they gave, that they, how they criticized me, how they did that, how they threw me under the bus and whatnot, and all the whole campaign. So in that moment, I was forgave everybody, and I asked the Lord what to do, and the Lord said, "Become a spiritual parent." And I'm like, "What do you mean, like a spiritual parent?" And he's, I realized right away, the new board president, I saw right away, she was messing up. She was making mistakes. She didn't know Robert's Rules of Order. She didn't know the legal requirements. She didn't know how to do anything. And I went to her, she's the one who just threw me out, her and her colleagues. And I said, can't think of her name now. Anyway, yeah, it was Carol maybe. And I said, "I will help you. I'm not the board president anymore, but I will help you be successful, because there's a lot that you don't know. Here's how this works. Here's how this works. Here's how these legal things happen. Here's how to run the meeting." And I went through it. If you have any questions, call me, talk to me. I was over that next season of time. So I was still a board member, but I'm a minority board member. And as it turns out, I helped her. I just became a spiritual parent to her. Now, she wasn't a believer. Or at least if she was a baby, more of a spiritual child. But I became a spiritual parent to her, and I helped her run that school district as a minority. We weren't mad. I wasn't mad. I wasn't trying to make her make mistakes or anything, because I cared about our school district, because my kids were in that school district and going to that school. And so this is the thing that's unfolding. And as I was a parent to her, things started to go well. They had elected a president and an assistant president and to the board. And after almost a year, like, it was just a single issue. Like, they were all only concerned about that. Anyway, I don't go into too much detail. But the lady who was the board president decided to resign from the board, because she didn't have any kids in the school district. She didn't care. It just didn't matter to her. And so she resigned from the board. And there was I wasn't involved in it, but there was a lot of huge conflict going back and forth between these kind of two groups, the old group. And in fact, I talked to some of those board members today. This is like over 10 years later, and they're still bitter. They're still angry with the new board members that came in and what they did. Still today, angry and bitter and just, grindy about that whole situation. So there was some big argument going back and forth between people in the community, and it boiled over into the various meetings and, all those committees and so forth. But I was fine. I just gave it to the Lord, and I was helping now. And then, but there was a huge conflict going on everywhere, and humidity, stuff, people were saying stuff and whatnot. Anyway, all that to say, the board president resigned, and the assistant board president, which again, I had built a relationship with her, she said, "I can't lead this school district. I can't be the board president, because I can't deal with all the conflict that's going on. I don't want to be thrown under the bus." And so here's this: the board president resigned, and in a few hours, we're having the meeting where we're going to elect the new president. Well, everybody assumed that it was going to be the vice president who was going to be elected the president. But 2 hours or 3 hours before that meeting, the board vice president, sorry, I'm getting into too much detail here. The vice president calls me and said, "Brian, I can't be the president of this board. Can you be the president of the board? And I'll be the vice president and whatnot." I forget even all the details, but I had had all this stuff happen, been thrown under the bus, and just letters to the editor and all these newspaper articles and everything. And I had 2.5 hours to decide if I would be willing to allow them to reelect me as the board president. She said, "I'll get everybody behind you if you're willing to be the board president." And honestly, I had 2 hours of thought. And I was going back and forth, talked to my wife. She said, "Yeah, you can do it. Go for it if you want to." Talk to the other board members, and they're like, "Don't do it. They'll throw you under the bus. This is going to the same thing will happen again. And then I prayed about it and talked about it. And then I decided, here's what I decided is kind of a sidebar. I said, I decided I was kind of fearful of another uprising, but at the same time, I kind of I didn't want to wonder the rest of my life what would happen or what could have happened if I just said no and didn't do it. So I decided to do it. The fear of failure, let me say it this way. The fear of not trying became greater than the fear of trying. So that's just in another little discussion we could have another time. But so I went in there that night and I was unanimously 9-0 reelected as the board president. And how's that? And so now I'm back in charge of this group that is and God just changed things. I was, I got to, I just got to do all this God stuff. Everybody respected me. Both groups now respected me, and I was able to run the school district. I ran it for another year, and then I decided not to run it's a 4-year term. I didn't feel like I should try to run it beyond. I felt like that was time for me. And when I came off of that board and was recognized, every person in that room and all the new board members and all the former board members gave me a standing ovation. Unbelievable. Like this totally upside down situation. And it just came back to the Proverbs 15:1. A gentle, soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. And I forgave. And this, a huge conflict. This is in the newspapers, people with signs, big signs outside of their houses about these two groups, a big political conflict going on in our community of 15,000 people, and just rhetoric and venom going back and forth. But in the middle of all that, God gave me the grace to not respond in anger, but to just give a soft words and turn that anger away. And honestly, it was such a God thing. I could go through the testimonies of different stories of how I, as the board president, I got to sign my son's diploma as he was graduating. I got to hand his diploma to him at graduation and, give him a hug. And I got to speak to all the employees and whatnot. There was just all this redemptive things that happened to me, because in the midst of that conflict, I could just respond in a biblical way and kind of throw that thing on the edge. So in a moment here, I want to give you an exercise, but let me just do one more thing. I'm kind of going to dip into our bonus chapter here where we talk about preventing conflict. And I have a little story I just want to share. Is one of the ways we prevent conflict is by understanding, we already mentioned about personalities. So I'm getting ready for our session here today, and I realized the air conditioning is not working in our building. So I go and look at the control, and it needs a new battery. So I'm like, I got to get new batteries. Well, I go downstairs in our office to look for the batteries. It's in a locked office. I don't know how to. So I text our office manager, hey, where can we get these batteries? And she says, oh, it's in this person's desk in the middle drawer. So I go over there to get this person's batteries and get the batteries from this person's desk. And I pull the drawer out. Well, I pull too far. The whole thing comes out and crushes and falls to the ground, and all the stuff that's in that drawer is now spread all over the floor. And I see the key. I went and got the keys. I got the battery. I got the air conditioning going. But I want to be preventive in preventing conflict. So I know the person who is in that who works in that office. They're a high C, very detailed by personality, and there's no way I'll be able to get everything back in the exact place and try and put it back and pretend that nothing happened, because I know even if I had a photograph, I probably wouldn't get everything exactly back where it was. And they would notice, next thing there'd be a memo going out on Monday morning, hey, who was in my office over the weekend? So I'm going to be preemptive of any kind of conflict there. I'm going to text that individual and say, hey, Ron, I had this thing Saturday morning where we were looking for batteries and I messed up your drawer. Sorry, but that's what happened. And I got the batteries and we're able to, have nice air conditioning instead of hot when we were doing the seminar on resolving conflict. So there's just an example of being preventive. We'll probably I try and want to get that bonus chapter or bonus in chapter in your notes, bonus content into the seminar as we're going forward. So the exercise that I have for you, we're going to be jumping in our next session into the basic methods of resolving conflict. I want to reflect back on Stephen Covey had a thing where he would draw a circle, and he would say, in this circle, the big circle is areas that you are concerned about. The next circle is areas that you can influence, and the small circle is areas that you can control. And so, here we got it right here. I want us to, as we're closing this session of the seminar, I want us to think about and make a list. You don't have to do a circle, but there's, let's just list it like this. Grab a piece of paper. I don't have room in the manual, or I would have laid it out here. The next time we do this, it'll be more professionally laid out here. But I want you to make a list, make 3 lists, one of things that are a circle of concern. And the next list is going to be your circle of influence. And the third area is your circle of control. So concern are things like the outside that you have no control over, like inflation or world hunger, or whether your team, wins its hockey match or football match or whatever. You have no control over past decisions. So that's all things. World peace. Those are all things that are the circle of concern, but you have nothing you can do to change that stuff. Next, inside of that, on your second list, let's call that the circle of influence. So now you can have a little bit of influence in this circle. It might be those who follow you on social media. It might be your reputation. It might be your character. It might be your experience, your productivity at work, or whether people, are drawn to you. But these things you can influence by yourself. And so the second list, I want it to be the circle of influence. And then the last list is the circle of control. These are the things you can absolutely change. You might be able to change things in your circle of influence, but so sorry, I would, if I had, I can't really get this up on the screen. No, anyway, sorry, I would just, when we have better notes, we'll be able to get a little better thing up, maybe show this on the screen. But the circle of control, which now is your list of things you can control, are your thoughts, your words, your actions, your behavior, your decisions, your choices, your attitude, your mindset, my mood, my work ethic, all of that stuff. So you have things that you're concerned about, first list. Second list, things that you might be able to influence. And the last list is things that you can control, things that absolutely have to do with you. And then as you make changes in yourself, which is the biblical perspective that we're looking at here, rather than looking at the speck in someone else's eye, Lord, what is the plank in my eye? What are the things that I can control? As I change those things, then I might be able to influence others, which is the circle of influence. And then eventually there's the circle of concern on things I'm concerned about, but really, all right, I can't change. So let me focus on changing the things that I can change. So I'm just going to finish this session of the seminar with that assignment. Areas of concern, areas of influence, and areas of control. I'd like you to make 3 lists. Personally yourself, and then if you're in a format where you can discuss, I'd encourage you to do that with others, and use it as a level, the first level of self-awareness as we start to unpack the rest of these things in the seminar. So I think I'm going to turn things back over to Dave Hibbert.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. Really, really good content. Thank you so much for developing this material. A lot of this is brand new material. This is not an older course. This is a lot of it is brand new material that Brian's put together after we started discussing about conflict. And it's such a timely thing because of COVID and because of everything else going on.
Mm-hmm.
There's conflict in marriage, there's conflict in families, there's conflict in the workplace, there's conflict in the community, conflict at the airport. It's like wherever you go, right?
Totally.
The grocery store, there's conflict. It's just such an important time to get some really good skills and integrate them into our lives so that we can deal with all these conflicts, because we don't want this the challenge of the last couple of years to damage our relationship, especially with our spouse or our family. That's number one, right? But then even our relationship with God, some of these to build into the way that we understand the Lord and see his perspective. Thank you for addressing that issue too. What's the Lord's perspective on all these things? So thank you so much, Brian. I know the online, you can do the assignment. If you're in the group in the chapel, you can, I think we're going to facilitate that for a few minutes. But then don't forget, we have more sessions going on tomorrow afternoon. Come back online or meet us in person, and really good content coming up. As Brian said, methods of resolving conflict, understanding our own style, which is so important, and then getting into prospering in our relationship so that we don't have so much conflict. So thank you so much, Brian, and we'll see you next time for more sessions. Okay, bless you.